So I wanted to say welcome and thank you everyone for attending today's Mattel Playmaker Speaker Series. We are going to jump right into today's speakers. So we have so much to cover in a small amount of time. So welcome, Kenna and Nicole, and let's get this conversation started.
Thank you, Tony. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kenna O'Brien. I'm a product design manager on the Barbie team. I'll start by saying that if you'd have told me a few months ago that I, a white woman, would be addressing the topic of race in a Mattel-sponsored event, I'd have not believed you. My hope for today is that this is a conversation we can have moving forward without feeling like it's a taboo subject. In the last month, I, like many whites, have been confronted with the fact that there's drastic racial inequity happening for our Black friends and colleagues. While the Black community has been telling us this for 400 years, many of us are finally hearing and trying to figure out how to partner in allyship for the first time. In saying that, I now understand that the option to care or not is the very definition of white privilege. In deciding to speak at Playmakers on this subject, I am thankful to have had guidance from Black colleagues on how to approach this subject. Thank you to each of you who took the time to talk and email through this with me. In the midst of my research, I stumbled upon our speaker today, Nicole Allen, on a Zoom call titled The Conversation, where she spoke on a panel about a wide variety of topics surrounding racial injustice. Today, I'm going to be asking Nicole some questions around allyship, but if you have questions as well, please feel free to use the chat. Without further ado, Nicole Allen.
Hi there. Thank you so much, and I appreciate that. And I just also want to say thank you to everybody that is joining this discussion today. It is a privilege to get this opportunity to speak to you all. It kind of has familiarized me with some of the things with math and with different organizations there, and so I feel very grateful and blessed to be able to enter into this space, with you all to discuss some things. Really excited for this to happen, and really excited for us to just continue on in this work, because this is really where it starts. We're meeting here for an hour today, but it is a continuous discussion. This should be, various meetings, various things, various conversations. So this is just the start. Just a little bit of a background about myself. I grew up in Los Angeles and in Portland, Oregon, from a biracial family. So saw both sides of the whole experience and dealt with our topic today of allyship through family things as well. My background is in communication, as well as I received a dual degree in Black Studies. So this is not only something that I'm living every day, but that I studied and I'm passionate about, and I'm really excited to be here to share information with you all. With that being said, there's going to be a lot of stuff today, and I know Kenna had mentioned, there could be questions that are coming up, so I just really encourage everyone to get a pen and paper right now, like write things down, take notes, because I feel like as we go over some of these topics, there's going to be things that just come up in your mind, or you didn't realize, or, oh, I want to follow up on this. I'll encourage you to really just do the research. One of the things that I know myself, which I'm just one singular Black woman, sharing my personal experience. This is not the end all be all, but I know that something that the Black community feels right now, and even just any BIPOC community, which is Black, Indigenous, persons of color, any of us are feeling is we live this life every day, and so sometimes it feels as a burden when people are coming to us. And as Kenna mentioned in her intro, the work is choosing, the privilege is choosing to participate or not. So I really just encourage people, yes, reached out to us at the end. I know Playmakers said that they would be sending out some resources that I'll also be providing, but I really just encourage everyone to do the research yourself, make sure that we really get in and do that. So yes, I'm excited. And what I would really like to start us off before Kenna and I get into these discussions is with that pen and paper that hopefully everybody has. I want you just to take 2 minutes and maybe or a minute, and even in the chat, type them up in the chat. And when we think about just privilege, bias, and stuff, what is a privilege that you have? I know for myself, privileges that I don't often think about is ableism. I'm an able-bodied person. I can go into stores. I can do different things. I can walk upstairs. I lived in New York for a while. I didn't have to think about which subway station had an elevator, had these things. So I just encourage, as we are starting to get into this, just to start thinking about what are these privileges that I have? We're going to go into white privilege, obviously, and we're going to define a few things today. So I just encourage everybody to just start taking notes and to just start jotting down like, oh, wow, I didn't think about that. That is a privilege that I have. And then at the end, we're going to go through some action steps and really kind of be like, how can we address those sort of things, if that makes sense. So yay. And I'm ready if you are.
All right, so we're going to get into this first question. And I feel like we need to get some definitions down before we get into all this, as there are a lot of terms discussed today. And some of you may not be sure what they mean. I know that I personally am learning myself. Nicole, can you start off by discussing your personal take on the following words: privilege, bias and prejudice, stereotype, and racism?
Yeah. Like I said before, again, I am one woman. So this is my take through my experiences. Your colleagues, your Black colleagues, your family and friends that identify in these communities could have different definitions. So for me, and for today, this is how I will be defining and using these terms. I think in order to understand privilege, you have to see through the lens of disadvantage, right? We have to think about if we're privileged, that means someone else is disadvantaged in certain ways. Instead, it's all the, extra things I have. See what don't these people have, right? What don't they have access to? How are these systems and practices really set up to the detriment of others that are unlike me? So again, my example of the ableism, and that's a privilege, having that. How we're doing certain things in the world where we have access to food, right? We have the privilege to have grocery stores. Some people don't even have grocery stores. They're in food deserts. So when we really think about privilege, we really want to frame it again through the lens of disadvantage. And a lot of times that's easier for us to kind of understand those sort of things. Bias and prejudice are kind of interchangeable. We hear a lot of times, don't be prejudiced, don't be, someone was prejudiced against me. And so with defining that, it really is just like an unfavorable opinion or feeling, right? Formed beforehand without knowing any knowledge, thought, or reason, right? I'm just making this up. I'm basing this on maybe something someone's told me, or I just feel this way, right? So it's the same thing, kind of bias is on the same sort of levels, right? It's a particular tendency, trend, inclination, feeling, or opinion, again, that's preconceived or that might not have reason. So sometimes we have biases that we don't even realize. For those of us that live on the West Coast, I didn't even realize some of the biases I had about when I lived on New York. So these are interchangeable, not just in race relations, but across the board, where do we have these things? And then following along with that, we have stereotype, which again is an unfavorable opinion or feeling, formed beforehand, right? All of these we're forming these things without knowledge, which in general in life, we don't want to be doing, right? We want to be forming opinions, speaking on things after we have learned stuff. So yeah, that's stereotyping. Then we have racism, which in the Black community, and I think in the BIPOC communities, racism is not this trigger word, right? We can discuss it, where a lot of times in white communities or in white discussions or around white folks, it's a trigger hot button word because it has so much weight behind it. And I think in order for us to really understand what racism is, racist, all of that, we have to understand that there's levels to it. Far too often, we're looking and thinking, people, I'm not racist. I'm not racism, right? Because I'm not doing these blatant things. I'm not part of the KKK, right? That's what racism is these sort of things. And we have to understand that there's levels to racism. You know, we talked about institutionalized racism. We talk about structural racism. We talk about interpersonal, internalized, right? And just to kind of quickly dive into those sort of things, institutional would be the policies, practices that reinforce these racist standards, particularly in a workplace organization, right? Who's getting promoted? What does the admin staff look like? What does the higher ups look like? Yes, you might be diverse, but do I have managers, supervisors, directors, SVPs, all of that look like color? Or, you know, what are we doing? So that's a lot of institutionalized. And you have structural. And structural is, again, multiple institutions collectively upholding racist policies and practices. So an example like that would be society or even higher education. How are they coming together that, again, are reinforcing those other words that we were defining? Then you have interpersonal racism, right? So that's, again, those are the specific racist acts or even the microaggressions, right? Someone saying, you know, someone could be hearing me speak and after the fact they want to give me props and they can say, oh my gosh, you're so articulate. And I know if there's any Black folks in here today, that's a trigger button for us because for far too often we weren't looked at as that. And it seems as a compliment, but it's not a compliment because then it's saying that you were expecting us to be something else other than articulate, right? So again, those are those interpersonal, those microaggressions. Oh, you changed your hair today. Oh, it's a new hairstyle, right? All these little things that we don't think about it, we have to put forethought in of how could this be perceived? How could this be received, you know? And then you have internalized racism. So those, again, are those subtle, overt messages kind of that reinforce those negative beliefs in individuals. Oh, we think that Black folks are doing more crime. And then you got someone like the president or some other folks saying, oh, these thugs, and referring to people in these ways. All those do is kind of reinforce, whether that individual person is verbalizing or not, they reinforce those kind of internal stereotypes, those internal biases and prejudice. So again, I just really want people to take away, especially from racism, that racism is multiple things. And I have always believed that the only way to not be racist is to actively fight against racism, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Nicole. So number 2 is around ally, which is our big word of the day. Can you help us dive a little more into what is an ally and what it means to be one?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because this has become such, again, a hot topic, as we were saying, like allyship. You know, if people were not aware of what allyship meant or what is an ally, like they're learning and they're knowing now, hence why we are doing this session today. And something to really think about that I have come to find, because again, I've grown up in a Black household and a white household, is that ally, or someone referring to someone as ally, is far often used more in white communities than in Black communities. I'll speak for myself personally. I'm not sitting here referring to my best friend who happens to be a white woman as an ally. I'm like, she's just down with the cause. So when we really think about allyship, you know, we want to consider, are we saying this to be with the trend? It's the trendy thing to do. You know, what are we really meaning when we say ally? You know, what is that? And when we really look at just the actual definition of ally, it's to unite formally, right? To unite, to unify, right? To associate or connect for a common cause or purpose, right? We're coming together, we're melding, we're coming together, right? And something that really strikes me as I think about this act of allying and uniting and stuff is the word alliance. An alliance is such a strong word, right? And when we think about alliance, alliance is merging efforts, right? We're merging efforts. We're agreeing to cooperate with a common end goal. It's not, oh, I'm an ally, I feel bad for Black folks, or I feel what's going on in the world, like, let me step up. No, I want you to join the cause. I want you to put your skin in the battle. You know, I don't need someone to hold my hand. I want you to get down in the dirt with me. And when we think about alliance, especially in history, alliance, you know, it's coming together, these two countries, these two entities to become all the more powerful and strong. And just like a reminder, saying you're an ally is much easier than actually being an ally. You know, what is your follow through? And what is your action that you're taking? I want to share a quick quote from Roxane Gay, who, if you do not know her, write her name down. Google her. She is an amazing Black queer woman who she's a writer, she's a professor, she's a social commentator. She's like a doesn't hold anything back, just lets you know, and is very transparent and very knowledgeable. So this is what she said, which I think really centers to what I was just addressing. Black people do not need allies. We need people to stand up and take on the problems born of oppression as their own, without remove or distance. We need people to do this, even if they cannot fully understand what it's like to be oppressed for their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality, their ability, class, religion, or any other marker of identity. We need people to use common sense to figure out how to participate in social justice. So again, you know, that really just goes back to what we talked about with an alliance, right? We don't, as a Black woman, I don't want lip service. I don't want you saying, oh, I'm an ally, I'm doing, you know, like, let me spread on social media, let me do these sort of things. You know, I want you to take up arms with me. You know, I want you to join in this fight and oppression, because ultimately, the advancement of people of color, the advancement specifically of Black people within the United States, means that we all advance. And I think when we get that mindset, you know, that really just makes a lot, you know? And just to ultimately remember that, like, as kind of mentioned before, like, the privilege to kind of choose if I'm turning it on or off. And so if you want to claim you are an ally, you have to understand that, you know, you're always on, because Black folks, we live in this. We don't get to choose, you know, persons of color, we don't get to choose, you know what? I don't want to deal with racism today. I'm not going to deal with this when I go to the store, you know, or even in workplaces, you know. I don't want to answer all these questions. I don't want to have this stuff coming on. It's just understanding that, hey, it's a 24/7, 365 day life. And so if you're willing to take this journey with us of being an ally, if you really feel in your heart, hey, I need to do this, this is what's needing to happen, then, you know, whether that's intrinsically or outwardly, just know that it's always action steps you always have to be on. So that's allyship, which is really great.
As a follow-up question to what you just discussed, do you believe that in order to be an ally, one has to understand that you can't be silent on the topics of race and racism, bias and prejudice, and the other words you previously defined? Is the popular tagline, "Silence is violence," true? Is some level of discomfort needed, in your opinion?
I think that statement is really true. The silence is violence is statement is really true. You know, we look at just if you all have been on social media or just really the news, anything within the past few weeks since George Floyd has happened. And you see the amount of voices, right? You see people sending out petitions, calling this folks, protesting, doing all that, right? We had our collective voice was raised. And we already see some of these things are changing, right? Some of these departments, LA, LAPD, they're not allowing certain types of chokeholds. All these things are different, changing. We have in Louisville the Breonna's Law, which, just a reminder, Breonna's the people that killed her, that murdered her, are still working, are still part of the police force. I just have to put that out there. But they've passed a law that you can't do no-knock warrants. You can't do all these things. So we see how our collective voice is helping, right? That's all communities come together. But it's definitely made the advancement because the white community decided to join in on us, right? We needed that because Black folks have been talking about this. We've been talking about police brutality. We've been doing all of this stuff since we arrived in North America. We have been doing that all. You look at even Colin Kaepernick a couple years ago, which his silent protest of just taking a knee was specifically for police brutality. And you see all the hate, all the things that he got. So this past month has really shown us that when we are not silent, right, we can do things. We can make changes. When we come together, when we form that alliance, we can really spark change, And when we don't, when white voices ultimately are silent, that is violence against people of color, right? That is violence of now they don't feel I have to have body cams, I can do these chokeholds. Now they're not worried, oh, I'm not worried I'm going to be filmed. I love it now that I'm seeing, people on their cell phones filming other people, and it's not just people of color, right? It helps us, right? It takes the burden off us, right? And mental health, right? And mental illness, which is stress, which is PTSD, and that's a whole other health disparities thing when you talk about Black folks, right? That's violence against our bodies. So having that happen, knowing that, again, there's those 4 types of institutionalized racism, right? That these things are intertwined into our things, that you don't just have to be speaking up as far as like going to a protest or doing different things. You can speak up in different ways, whether it's your conversations within your own families, whatever it may be. When we use our voice, there's only ever been in history shows this power, And in all honesty, and I'm sure any of my Black folks that are in here today, or just any POCs or any marginalized community, whether that's queer, LGBTQIA, whether that's disabled people, whatever they may be, it's a burden that's on us, as we already said, So we are discomforted every day, And again, it's a choice. And so when white folks and non-POCs, non-BIPOCs choose to share in that pain, then they can both sympathize and empathize with us, right? And that allows healing for us to say, I got this. Take this backpack off. Let me carry it for a bit. We're still walking together, but let me take this backpack on a little bit, Because unfortunately, we as humans, we know as humans that we only ever change things when we feel uncomfortable, right? If I'm comfortable, you know, I'm comfortable with the brands of milk I'm buying or whatever, maybe the perfume I like. If I'm comfortable with it, I'm going to keep buying this perfume. But if I use that perfume and all of a sudden I get an itch or it makes me uncomfortable, I have to change, right? So no matter what that may be, when we are uncomfortable in a situation, it forces us to reevaluate, to look, to take a step back. Why am I feeling uncomfortable in this, right? Oh, I don't like this. Let me change. Versus when we're comfortable in anything, oh, I'm comfortable, doing certain things, then ultimately, why do I need to change something? Why do I need to do anything? So just keeping that in mindset of, okay, how do I sit within the uncomfortability and to know that, hey, that's the only way that growth is going to happen. So again, like just summarizing that all up, just there's different ways to be non-silent. It's not just even vocal things, it's thoughts, it's actions, it's so many things. It's not just speaking up. And don't think just because you are speaking up or saying certain things that that's making change, right? It's dynamic. Allyship is dynamic ultimately.
Thank you. So Nicole, you briefly mentioned that a lot of this stuff is tied up in American history. Do you believe that learning about the history and treatment of Blacks throughout America, distant and not so distant, is an important foundation for us to have?
Yeah. As I briefly explained before, I got a dual major in communication and Black studies. And being a Black woman who came from a family where Black pride, Black power, all of this stuff was emphasized, knowing my family history, being able to trace that, I knew that that was so important to who it made me as a person. And I was so passionate enough that I went to go study it in college. And I started off as a communication major, went into Black studies and as just some electives, and was like, wow, there's so much information that we do not know out here. My background as well, I've worked 15 years in education, in K through 12 education. And most of them are in low resource schools in Oregon, California, and New York. And when I look at some of the curriculum, and when I look at even the social studies, or you see in Texas, just within the past 2 years, they changed their textbooks to take out slavery or to refer to it in different ways. Like, we are not getting the full picture. And that's something that we should all be upset about. A lot of these people are kind of actually hit me too, having this racial awakening, right? Of being able to understand these sort of things. And we get upset, like, why am I not learning this? Why did people not ever teach me this? And, that's something that we have to work on within our school systems, but taking the time to know our history, we know then why this is happening, all this stuff that's happened within police violence in the past couple weeks, but really it's every day, like since George Floyd's happened, there's been like over 100 police murders or people killed by police. And to just know this history, some people are, wow, I thought we made all this progress. We had in the 60s, we had all these things. We thought we made this progress. I can't believe, this is not blatant. This is not, what? You're shocked. And it's like, if you understand how ingrained that this is in every system, right? It's so much that we're just not even told. We think, 400 years ago, right? African slaves have come like into the Americas from like the 1500s, right? Since then, right? And if we really think about, like, there's been some really important cases that have happened, laws in the past 200 years, maybe even less, 150 years, that are still important for today, that are still either in our state constitutions, right, or just got taken out. So many things that still are happening today. And I just real quick want to just do some timeline. And again, I suggest people jot down these, even if it's the ruling or the date, you know, to just further look into it, because I'm just going to give you a basic, you know, what it's about. But I really encourage people to look at, like, what is this sort of, what was this case? What did that mean? How did that affect the dynamics? How was it was supposed to change things, but did it really, you know? So I really encourage, you know, and I'll kind of go a little slow, for people to really look into these things. So I'm not going to start in 1619. There's a lot of things that happen with enslaved Africans. And I really encourage as well people, it's a term that I've been using, a phrase that I've been challenging myself to use more, is enslaved Africans instead of slaves, because slaves is like, that's all they were, right? They were people before, they were people after, right? So really challenging people to use enslaved Africans or enslaved people, right? Not slaves. So in 1857, we had the Dred Scott ruling, right? Which might be familiar, that name might be familiar to some of you, maybe it's not. So the Dred Scott ruling was when the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the Constitution, which we got 4th of July coming up, we got all these things, equal rights, all this stuff, right? But the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution was not meant to include Blacks as U.S. citizens, right? This is, you know, 150 years ago, 160 years ago. We were not citizens, right? The country, 1776, had been formed. So for almost 100 years that it's supposed to be this, we were not citizens, right? Then after that, after 1857, you have the Reconstruction era, right? Which was a lot of good things were somewhat happening. It was a little bit of forward movement. And that's when we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? If anybody has not watched Ava DuVernay's The 13th on Netflix, I suggest you go watch that, because it really talks about how the history of enslaved Africans, slavery stopped, how this has become into this prison industrial system that we are in present now. So I really encourage people to watch that. But the 13th Amendment, which was 1865, June 19th, that was this last Friday, Juneteenth, aka Emancipation Day, that was when slavery was formally abolished. And what I want you to know about that date, right? We know 1865 was free. Abraham Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, right? So slaves were freed in 1863, but it took 2 years to get out to Texas, to get out to everywhere, for people to know that they were free. And I encourage you to look into the reasons why the 13th Amendment came about. It wasn't, we feel bad about enslaving these people. It was definitely on some capitalism things. So I really encourage people to watch that documentary. So then you have the 14th Amendment, which was citizen rights, and that's 1868. Equal due process. It ultimately nullified the Dred Scott ruling, right? So about 10 years later. Then you have the 15th Amendment, 1870. That was the right to vote, right? When we technically had the right to vote, but we know the Voting Rights Acts come later, 95 years before the Voting Rights Act. Then in 1875, they had the first attempt for the Civil Rights Act, right? Which was, sorry, looking at my notes here. So in 1875, that's when the first Civil Rights Act. In 1883, that act was ruled unconstitutional, right? Unconstitutional. And after that act, Congress did not pass another civil rights law, act, anything until 1957, until 82, right? So then I'm just going to go through these next ones real quick. You have 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson. That's when Jim Crow, started. And Jim Crow is the separate but equal, right? Then we have 1948, Shelley v. Kramer. And that was when a court ruled that it can, a restricted covenant can no longer be enforced. So basically that's like, and this is true in Oregon, and it's still in some of the house deeds, these older homes in Oregon, that would literally say, do not rent or sell to Negro or Chinamen, with that language. You know, we think about, what? Even if you had the money, even if you had the resources, even if you had the education, all these things, you could not own this home because it was in the house deed. And a lot of that language was not getting taken out. And it's still happening today with racial discrimination in housing and whatnot. Then we have, ultimately, we'll skip forward to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, as a lot of us are familiar, right? And probably some folks in here affected them, right? So that ultimately reversed that Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, right? Kind of the end of Jim Crow, right? Because it was like, we're having desegregation, right, in schools. Then 64, you have the Civil Rights Acts, which is really the official end of Jim Crow, right? That's outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, all that. And if you all are up to date with the news, just like a week or so ago, that same Civil Rights Act was used, the Supreme Court upheld for LGBTQIA when it comes to the workplace of not being discriminated against. So we're still making progress. Then we have the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and we have, which prohibited racial discrimination voting. But if you are familiar with what happened in Atlanta in their voting 2 weeks ago, voter suppression is still happening. It's rampant, you know? So even though we have this Voting Rights Act in 65, like the things that it was put into place, are still happening. And then ultimately we have 1967 Loving versus Virginia, which allowed interracial marriage. So up until that point, it was illegal. My parents would not have been able to get married, right? I would not be here. A lot of my friends and family would not be here. And so all of these dates, I really just want us to know this history, because a lot of times we're like, well, racism happened so long ago, or this was my family's things, you know, and I'm not a part of this. But it's like these systems are still in place. And there was people that were born before some of this stuff happened, whether it's yourself, your family members, your parents, your siblings, whatever it may be, that this is relative history, especially when we think about US history or just Western history. 50, 60, 70, 80 years is a very short span. And so I just wanted to take some extra time. I know that was a little long-winded, but I just wanted to take some extra time for people to really kind of get a picture of, it's not slavery ended. We had Jim Crow stuff, you know, we had all this separate but equal things. And now here we are, we've made so much progress. What do you mean this is happening? Like, this has been present, you know? So yeah.
Wow. Thanks, Nicole. That's a lot of information about what has gone on in the past 150 years. Some people would say that racist mindsets are such a long time ago that we've made a lot of progress in the generations to follow through now. What do you say to those people who believe we're not where we were then? Do you feel it's especially important for white and non-Black people of color who are entering the journey to allyship to ultimately understand how our whiteness and privilege contributes to and benefits from systemic racism?
Yeah, I think that is super important to know. And again, like, I really just love, like, specifically what you said kind of at the beginning of, like, it's a choice that I know that, like, I have to be doing this, you know, it's a constant thing. And so I think if we understand, you know, we want to, again, it's sitting with that uncomfortable, right? Don't nobody want to be called a racist or prejudiced or any of that stuff, but you have to understand, or even white privilege, in all honesty, you know, people, I worked hard for my money, I did all this stuff, what are you talking about? You know, like, different things that people feel that's a trigger button. And I think ultimately we have to understand that, like, all of those laws and acts that I listed were put in place to either enforce earlier on, right, with that first one about the Dred Scott, that, hey, you're not even citizens, right? That they were put in place to either enforce or to combat against the inequalities that are present in American society. But unfortunately, a lot of that inequalities are still present, right? As I mentioned, the Voting Rights Act, right? Voter suppression, right? In communities where they know that it's a Democratic vote, they know that it's a Black community, they are taking polling sites away. They're not allowing certain things, right? So there's so many things that are ingrained that we want to think, oh, we passed these laws. Black person and white person can get married. Oh, we are able to own property, or we have these different things, but it's still super ingrained in that. And I just kind of want to just briefly kind of go over some things that those things are still in. Obviously, with the current times, we are understanding that those inequalities are in policing and the prison systems, right? America has the largest incarcerated population of all major first world countries, just countries in general. We have the highest thing, and it's for profit. Again, shout out, please go watch that the 13th by Ava DuVernay, because this really goes into depth on this, right? But it's specifically for America. When we think about the prison systems, persons of color, specifically Black men, are overrepresented in the majority population in these prisons and jails. However, we only represent such a small population. You know, you can look at again the policing. We see these things that have happened, even what happened with the young gentleman in Atlanta, or certain things that you can find just as many videos out there showing a non-POC, a non-Black person, a white person doing the same things, and an officer's life doesn't feel threatened, right? So those things are still present, right? Literally, we have to understand that our policing system ultimately started from slave catchers. Look at it. Then we got to think about generational wealth. So that goes again when people are thinking, hey, you know, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. You got to understand that when slavery was happening, we had the most millionaires, right? And billionaires, right? Because it's free labor. So that has been passed down. You don't think about people couldn't own property, people couldn't have all these things, right? So generational wealth. And these are all these things I'm kind of discussing too. I'm going to briefly touch, but I really encourage people to go look up that. What is generational wealth, right? We think about banking. Okay, so let's say I got the money. I can do all this stuff. I can buy a house. Our loans are higher. We're not getting these, the PPP stuff that's just happened with the stimulus package. We don't have this access, right? Or we come into a bank and people are assuming just by the way you look that you don't have funds, you're not going to be able to pay on time, all those stigmas, right? I'm just going to do this point. I want to share this point that someone in the chat said that Explained on Netflix. It's a series on Netflix. They have a specific episode on generational wealth. So thank you for making that point, because that's something that we really need to look into and understand. Again, family dynamics and family structure, right? The family system, the Black family was pulled apart. When a child got of age during slavery, you're pulled apart. We have these policing systems, right? So our structure, health and diet, especially within Black communities, and access to food and food deserts and all those things, those are still where people of privilege and people that are not, you know, in these communities of color don't have to think about or really experience, right? You look at redlining and property ownership. Again, like I said, some of those things are still in the house deeds, right? And redlining, for those that are not familiar with redlining was you were only allowed to live in this certain area, right? We redlined this area to where Blacks could live, okay? And then now we talk about, you know, you have this influx of white folks coming in and taking these spaces that were, and it's pushing Black folks out more and more and more. You're being redlined. We were only allowed to live in these things. And now when people want to come in, you know, this is happening. So I encourage you all to, again, whether you're from California, wherever you're from, look into redlining. The drawing of district lines when it talks to voting, right? That has been changed. We do those certain things where let's redistrict. Oh, if we see that this is a predominantly Black community, how can we redraw those lines? Again, the voter suppression, as we talked about. Like, I very much encourage you all, because this is a voting year, to look at what is happening with voter suppression. There's a lot. I very much encourage you all to look at that. We look at the sexualization and adultification of people of color, of young children of color. A young Black girl, at 12 or 13 is adultified. Again, that's a new term, adultification. That the sexualization, we're looking at that, right? These are young women. It was their fault something happened. Do we look at the same? I challenge you to look. Do we look at the same when that comes to young white women? You know, with Tamir Rice, you know, the young boy, the 12-year-old boy who just had a birthday, would have had a birthday this past week, that was killed by playing in a park years ago because he had a squirt gun. Gun. They pulled up on him and killed him. Now, would that have happened? Would that officer have felt a threat if that had been a young white child? Those are the things we got to think about. And then ultimately, public funding and our school systems. Again, I worked in education, and our school systems are abysmal. And you think about, where is the funding going to? Again, what type of teachers are happening? Who are we teaching? You know, who's teaching us? Who's teaching the kids of color? And so all of these things are just ultimately, again, why we have to look at racism, privilege, all that stuff is still very prominent today. It's not just a slavery, not just a Jim Crow. This stuff is intertwined into our systems ultimately.
Thanks, that was amazing. You've provided so much history, a background, and an insight into the American Black experience, including how it correlates to allyship. Let's dive a little more into the latter and center it closer to home. What are your thoughts on how we at Mattel, as toy makers, can understand the importance of inclusion and diversity? And I don't know if I'm going to throw a zinger at you, but do you think that there are any ways that brands themselves can seek to be allies?
I think ultimately, the importance of inclusion, diversity, even if we're not centering on allyship, right? If we're just saying inclusion and diversity is so important. And a lot of times that is seen less in these corporate brands, in these organizations, right? Because your personal life could look very diverse and inclusive and all that, but does your working space reflect the same? And so kind of how I started at the beginning, this is great that you all are having me here and we're talking about this, but it cannot end here. And so what I challenge brands and organizations and even Mattel, what I would say is, this has to be a series of things, right? This can't be this one-off. One year we have our big full day of diversity training. Yay, we did this, right? We know that doesn't work. It's the same thing that it shows with the policing right now, right? Oh, they did this 1 5-hour session and now they've ended up. No, it has to be continuating, right? And so having things in Mattel where, you know, you're coming together, right, and leading these things, and, you know, ultimately knowing that this is, as we said again, you're always on. It's going to be constant work. And so I think, especially having Mattel as a toy maker, right, where people are looking to you all to show diverse toys, to show diverse products, right? Because for far too often, I grew up and I didn't have dolls that looked like me. Or if I did have a Black doll that looked like me, it was only the one style and the one color, right? And so people look to you, and ultimately because you work with children are our future. I know it's a corny thing to say, but children are literally our future. And so if they're exposed to these things and it becomes the norm to them, all I see is multiple styles of Barbie dolls. All I see is multiple toys that could are not being genderized and targeted just towards boys or just towards girls, right? The more inclusivity that we have, right, it can become the norm. You know, they think that this is what should be happening. You know, and I also think when it comes to inclusion and diversity, and I hope I'm not stepping on any toes when it comes to math, but they are just a group of from my understanding, of Black folks coming together, and in addition to their job, right, their title role, They're out here putting things together, doing different things, right? So understand that the burden should not just always be on those sort of groups, right? You kind of taking the initiative to say, after, you and I met, hey, this was awesome. We need to have this. I don't know how we're going to make this happen, but we need to have this, right? And I don't want it to be my voice. I want it to be someone else's voice, right? So creating those spaces and not putting just a burden on everybody, and just really looking and seeing how can we diversify things. I think that ultimately is what's most important. How can we look into our hiring practices? This is for all brands, right? How can we make sure that maybe we need to have a track of, young people of color, just people of color to move up, right? Where are we not? Maybe what is the mentorship needing to happen? But ultimately, as a brand, you're what people are looking for. You are curating, ultimately, the taste, the styles, the culture. And so that's a lot of power in your hands. And so ultimately, it just has to be multifaceted. It has to be having more things like this. It has to be having diverse products, and ultimately coming together that like this work is just starting now. And I think if brands can have that mindset, then we can only go up from here.
Thank you. That gives us so much to think about. I want to wrap this up by getting your take on what we as individuals can do specifically to be a better ally and put our allyship in action. As you described, that's a necessity of being an ally. How, as the title of this session states, can we better support?
Yeah. So again, like I just was saying, right? Holding more spaces like this, literally. And it doesn't even have to be on a grand scale. It could be within departments. It could be whatever, things like that, right? So that's as a company what we can do. What can you do in your own home, right? We know social media is nice and we're doing this and we're protesting, but what can I do in my specific home? And do I have children? And am I getting diverse children's books? Am I making sure that the schools that my children are in are having diverse teachers? And if they're not, am I going and talking to the school board? Am I saying sort of things, right? How am I exposing myself? Do I come from a family that has prejudice, bias, all those things that we talked about? Like, it's hard, but do I need to have those conversations? What can I do, right? It doesn't always have to be in the limelight, We're not trying to show up, oh, I'm a better ally than this person because I'm doing A, B, C, and D, right? As I said earlier, it's internal and external work, that we need to be doing. There's so many things. Again, this is a voting year. Voting is not just for the president or these major things, even your senators or your congressmen. That's your school boards, right? That's your county board of supervisors. That's all those things that are ultimately these folks that are making the decision of where people are spending their money, right? They're the ones that are redrawing those lines. They're the ones that are going after banking companies, all these things. So voting in diverse ways and diverse things really can help ultimately. And then if we think about, all the things that we benefit, right? The things that Black folks want, the things that a lot of communities of color want, right? Greater educational support, a larger social safety net, improved public services, right? Mass transit, healthcare, et cetera, right? These are things that would help all Americans, right? Not just these communities of color. So what can we do to help support that, And ultimately, the path is going to look different for everyone. And you're going to have days that you're like, this is overwhelming. And so finding balance. I'm a healer and do other work as well. So I'm a big person on balance. And I just really want to make sure that you find balance in things, right? I'm doing a lot, right? Social media can be overwhelming. If you need to take a day, take a day. Maybe it's some internal stuff. It's those sort of things. What else can we be doing? Think about if you've been taking notes, and at the beginning, right, we were talking about like just write some privileges that you're doing down. For those specific privileges, maybe jot next to them right now, like what are these specific action steps that I could take? oh, maybe a privilege is I always eat at my favorite restaurants or this stuff. Let me try something else. An action step is let me go support a Black business in a different way. Oh, if I normally am the one that speaks or does certain things, how can I let someone else, you know? So I really challenge you all, if you have that list, you know, whether in the moment now or even after the fact, how can we go through and do those personal things? Because every person's journey is different and it will look different, you know? But ultimately, we just have to understand that, again, it's action and you're always on, and that, like, you have a stake in the game. And I think when we realize that we have a stake in the game, our own skin's in the game, we want to have an alliance. What do I need to do to make an alliance?